I do firmly believe that you can't come up with a plan on one pass through the landscape because all ideas don't occur to you at the same time. And so if you go back after looking at a damaged landscape one time, some additional things you'll notice that you didn't notice the first time. And you might have the wrong impression on the first notices that you made. So the more often you walk it, and don't do it the next day. If you wait a couple of weeks and then you go back, you're much more apt to have a new set of original ideas. But that's not our business tradition. Our business tradition is we have a contract and we got to finish by Friday, so let's hurry through here and we'll come up with a plan and it'll be done on Friday and we'll fix it next week and whatever we do is exactly right and we'll never have to treat it again. And the watershed laughs at you.
That's landscape restoration expert Bill Zeedyk. He's someone who goes to areas that have been damaged by overgrazing and other human activities and brings them back to life with all these low-tech methods, which we'll be talking about on this program today. He's bringing back everything from streams and rivers to desert wetlands and city waterways and country roads. And so today you're going to hear about how that actually works. If some of the show is a little technical here and there, don't worry, hang in there. You'll still come away with the big ideas from this wonderful man who, at the age of 89, is a living treasure of knowledge and wisdom about using nature's tools for its own healing. You're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast, a co-production of Radio Cafe and Quivira Coalition. My name is Mary Charlotte Domandi. And before we start the podcast, I want to ask you, my dear listener, for a small favor. That is, please share this podcast with your friends and anyone you think might like it. This is the way we grow, word of mouth and recommendation. So if you know a few friends who you think might like the podcast, put it in an email or pass it on through your social media or whatever works for you. That would be so amazing. Thank you. And also, if you have a moment, rate and review the podcast. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and also at downtoearthradio.com. It makes a huge difference, so thank you. And now to our program. On today's podcast, we're featuring one of my heroes, Bill Zeedyk. He's a living legend in the regenerative agriculture and land restoration communities. His book, Let the Water Do the Work, is going into its third printing this year, thanks to the Quivira Coalition. He worked with the U.S. Forest Service for 34 years doing habitat management in national forests and a wide variety of geographies and ecosystems. After his retirement in 1990, he opened a whole new chapter of his life, and for the last decades, he's been restoring watersheds, waterways, and wetlands here in the desert Southwest. The work is mostly low-tech, involving rocks and natural materials, maybe some dirt movers, and it has the potential to restore landscapes that have been damaged by roads, overgrazing, and even wildfires. The techniques have names like one-rock dams, baffles, and rolling dips, and they're incredibly effective, inexpensive, and long-lasting ways to restore land by, as the title of the book says, letting the water do the work. Bill Zeedyk and his work are the subject of a new 5-part documentary by filmmaker Renea Roberts, who joins us on today's program. The documentary is called Thinking Like Water. It premiered at the Santa Fe Film Festival several months ago. I asked Renea how she met Bill and started making the film.
Well, I actually shot a workshop with Bill Zeedyk in the northwest corner of New Mexico, and he was there actually teaching road crew who were responsible for maintaining millions of miles of road in oil and gas extractive industry fields. I live off a dirt road, and so everything that he was doing was just amazing to me because it was really about keeping the water on the land while also making the roads easier to maintain and not so expensive and just better overall.
They started working together in 2017, and the result was the documentary series Thinking Like Water. It was filmed over 7 years, which is appropriate because the kind of restoration work that Bill does takes place over a time scale of years. He's well known for doing things like restoring watersheds and streams and overgrazed landscapes and damaged landscapes. He was a wildlife biologist in the Forest Service who worked with soil biologists and hydrologists to restore habitat and fisheries. So you restore here in the Southwest, here in New Mexico, what are called desert wetlands. And I was thinking, the term desert wetland for people who aren't desert dwellers might seem like an oxymoron, like desert wetland, like how does that work? Tell us about these desert wetlands. They're incredibly important to this landscape.
Yes, they are incredibly important because probably 75 or 80% of wildlife, birds, and all different varieties of wildlife are dependent on water or wetlands associated with a quote-unquote desert wetland.
The problem is that when land is damaged, the water falls on a piece of land but runs off too quickly. I asked Bill about the different things that people do that damage the land.
Well, we are used to seeing the impact of roads on the landscape or a subdivision on the landscape and all the associated driveways and patios and whatever, all of which the water spills off of. We're not used to looking at watershed damaged by overgrazing, and I want to make that very clear. There's a huge difference between proper grazing and overgrazing that doesn't pay attention to the productivity of the land. And then we don't recognize the very severe adverse effect that early wagon roads had on the landscape. Long before there was a bulldozed road, there were roads created by horses and wagons, and many, many times the road created thereby paralleled the edge of what was then the wetland or the creek, and at some point the two-track from the wheels of the wagon had to cross the wetland, and at that point you catch the creek, and the creek runs down the wagon road forevermore.
So when the water runs along the path of wagon wheels instead of the meandering and curving path of the natural stream or creek, the water moves in a straighter line. It runs down faster, and that causes erosion. And when you have erosion, the creek gets deeper into the ground. It incises, as they say. So the water that would have spread across the land just runs through it, and the surrounding land stays dry. When the water is acting as it should and the stream is healthy, the water spreads beyond the banks of the stream. That's called the floodplain, and the floodplain is incredibly important. A river or a stream isn't just the width of the water that you see, it's actually much wider.
It's much wider underground if it's stable. On the other hand, if all the water runs down the road because it's steeper, then it runs faster and it has more erosive force, so it gets ever deeper. And the surface layer that was once high in organic matter, dark, rich soil, is no longer wetted anymore. And subsoil gets exposed and the water doesn't seep into it like it did in the surface soil. So it has many adverse impacts.
And this has effects on, for example, if people are trying to graze there, those meadows are a lot drier.
Yes. And sadly, the wetlands tend to be a small percentage of the land area, maybe 2%, 2 to 5%. And the pastures are much larger. So economically, it's not worth the expense of just fencing in the wetland. And so the wetland gets sacrificed in order to manage the pasture as a whole. And some landowners have changed that and put the wetland pastures into a separate, smaller unit that gets more intensively managed to take advantage of the wetland soil, because the wetland soils can produce 2,500 to 3,000 pounds of forage per acre versus 400 to 800 pounds, or even less on the hill slopes.
Do you have a sense of what the desert wetlands ecosystems looked like, say, 300 or 400 years ago?
Yes. Sometimes you can tell from the landform where the wetland used to be, and you can look at the drainage pattern and see what it would take to re-wet that. And I have a little rule I go by, but the river has much time. We're the ones in a darn hurry. And that goes for a watershed of any size. Once it stops getting worse, it starts getting better. And we have to figure out what it is that has it getting worse instead of getting better.
And what are the greatest forces right now making it worse?
The most common and widespread one is the effects of grazing. And I'm not anti-grazing. I'm only concerned about those methods of grazing that ignore the distribution of the water and ignore the most productive soils because they're only a small part of the landscape as a whole.
And realistically, when you restore a landscape, you're making it better for grazing.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of the methods that you use to spread water over a landscape and slow it down so that it has time to infiltrate into the soil.
Do you want 5 minutes to talk about that or 5 years?
I wish I had 5 years to do this. I mean, one of the things that's so beautiful about this film is that, I mean, it's not quite, but almost a how-to guide, right? I mean, there's so many parts of the film where we are watching people in the landscape literally moving rocks and being guided by you, Bill, in how to make these structures. And like, for example, one of the structures is called one rock dams, which doesn't mean it's one rock. It means it's one layer of rock.
Right.
Tell us about those. Like, what are they? How do they work?
Well, the one rock dam is a way to treat an incised channel.
An incised channel is one of those channels that's gotten so deep that the water isn't spreading onto the landscape.
It can be a foot deeper than it ought to be, or it can be 20 feet deeper than it ought to be. So every time there's a rainstorm, there's a load of sediment that gets washed down that channel. That sediment is the resource that can be collected and stored and fill that gully back up again and make the top of the gully level with the historic landform. So the one rock dam is used to raise the bed of the channel through the whole reach that's similar and the same grade.
So there's all this sediment that's washing too quickly down the stream when the stream is incised and eroded, and you can use that sediment to build the bed of the creek back up, whether it's building it up 1 foot or 20 feet. The one rock dam technique strategically places a layer of rocks inside the stream bed.
So if you put one rock dams at every bend or wherever any bend used to be, the crossover in the S is where you would put the one rock dam, and that raises that channel a foot, that part of the channel. Then you go downstream and you raise the next one a foot.
You usually build a one rock dam at a time of year when the stream bed is dry or at a low flow, and then when the rains come or the storms come or the runoff or the snow melt, when those things come, the rocks slow down the water and create temporary pools. The sediment in those pools then settles down to the bottom of the channel, and the stream bed fills up and starts to get higher from that settled out sediment.
That may fill in the first storm. It may take a couple years of storms. Then you wait for the vegetation to respond. It becomes wetland plants that can catch sediments and store them. And then at the point that all the one rock dams are full, then you raise them all the same amount for a second layer. I did work in some horrendously damaged watersheds in Mexico, where we had the summer rains, the monsoon rains were about 4 times as much water as we get here in New Mexico in a month in total. So in some places we filled the gully in the first storm or in a couple of weeks. But I've also done work in New Mexico, Arizona, wherever, that the watershed is in better condition, so there's less sediment in the flow, so it takes longer to store that material to the point that the One Rock Dam pond is full. And it's kind of ironic, with the less damage the watershed is, the longer the restoration takes, and the more intensely damaged it is, the quicker the response is.
I mean, it's interesting because one of the things that we see in this movie, Thinking Like Water, is there was a place where the channel, the stream, was so deeply in size that it was something like 10 feet below where it was supposed to be historically. And you're like, well, 6 inches a year, and it's been 20 years since we started putting in One Rock dams, it's filled up. So it's like this deeply incised channel literally gets shallower and shallower over these years because the water is slowed down with these little dams.
Yes, I did a project in Arizona where that occurred. We started doing work in 1997 with a series of One Rock dams and baffles to generate meandering. So between 1997, when we started, and 2016, when the last data that I have, the bed of the channel did come up 10 feet. And the channel went from a half a mile long, 2,500 feet long, to 3,400 feet long. And so the channel was much longer, so that means the slope was less steep because it was the same elevation, top and bottom. So vegetation moved in that was adapted to that, and that increased the roughness of the channel, so it caught even more sediment. So the bed of the channel came up and measured 10 feet in 20 years, or 6 inches a year.
We've put some of the before and after pictures in the show notes, which you can find at downtoearthradio.com. Renee, I wanted to ask you, what was the process like for you, filming over 7 years and seeing those streams come back little by little, seeing the landscape go from brown to this beautiful lush green and filling in sometimes to where you can't even see the One Rock dams anymore?
Yeah, well, it was amazing for me because, I knew a little bit, but not very much. So, when I came in and started shooting this, I didn't know the difference between a One Rock dam or a baffle or a lot of these things. So I basically was learning the whole time that I'm shooting. And so when we were just talking earlier about, okay, so if you have a One Rock dam, 2 of them in the creek, and it starts to catch sediment and then it all rises, it took a little while for me really to get that. And then as it kept layering on, it's like, oh, that's why it's so important when we have a major fire or something changes in the watershed. We have just a certain window to be able to capture all this sediment that's coming down. So if we can be a little bit more prepared where things are already degraded, we can take advantage of things that are changing in our climate.
So, for example, when you have a wildfire, there's more sediment from like the ash of the fire. Is that what you're saying?
Well, and also vegetation may be burned, so a whole hillside may be losing its sediment in bigger storms. So if down valley from that, there actually is like degraded creeks or arroyos or even upland areas, it might not be in the very bottom of the valley. If we can capture a little bit of that, we're starting to rebuild the system, or to help it rebuild.
Yeah.
But that's not something I really would have gotten in the first year or so of filming. And I actually, I kind of live in an area, it's not riparian, it's juniper and pinyon. But when I first got there, I kind of put like tree branches and stuff that had fallen off the juniper, and just did that in little areas of depression where the water would run when it rained. And so like 10 years later, I go by and I'm like, oh my gosh, this little area has kind of leveled out. And
you Zeedyked it.
I Zeedyked it. And I started Zeedyking it after I shot that road film with Bill. And then I just kind of played around. And I think that's what's really important too, is that every landscape is different. So you can take that thinking differently and thinking like water and have this relationship with nature and what's closest to you and learn. And that's where all those artistry in different parts really come into play.
Well, Bill, and you talk about this at different times in the film, there's a lot of trial and error involved in this work, and there's so much learning from your mistakes.
Yes, most of what I know I learn from mistakes, and often you learn the lesson more deeply, more solidly if you make a mistake rather than if by accident you get it right. You learn a lot more from mistakes than you learn from correct actions sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Not always.
For all of us, yeah.
It's a rule.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting and important to talk about is when you start restoring wetlands that are maybe upstream in a watershed, it's not just that area gets wetter and is holding water more. It's that water starts feeding into tributaries that then feed into bigger rivers and then really big rivers like the Colorado. So this kind of restoration work feeds far more than the small areas where you're working.
Yes. When you start to study a stream, or especially small headwater streams, most people like to work in a bigger river, and working in a little headwater stream is beneath their dignity. It's not worth the trouble. But all rivers are sustained by the headwaters.
Right.
And almost all of them are damaged. So we can work almost anywhere to reconnect a damaged stream.
Yeah.
So then you have to look at what the source of the water is. Is it just surface runoff during the time of a storm? Is it mostly from melting snow in the spring of the year? Is it coming from a spring that comes up from underground and spills a constant supply of water to maintain the stream? So what's the source? And that has a lot to do then with what the restoration treatments are. And when does the runoff occur? Is it constant year-round, or is it only immediately after a thunderstorm? Or is it only immediately after the snow melts in May or June? So you have to look at that to understand what's needed to implement effective restoration techniques.
Building on what you just said, it's very interesting to me that when you go into a landscape and you're trying to understand some of these questions, like where does the water come from, you will go into a landscape 25 times, according to the film, before you even start making a plan so that you can really understand that land. Tell us about that process.
Well, 25 times may be an exaggeration too. So, but I do firmly believe that you can't come up with a plan on one pass through the landscape, because all ideas don't occur to you at the same time. And so if you go back after looking at a damaged landscape one time, some additional things you'll notice that you didn't notice the first time. And you might have the wrong impression on the first notices that you made.
Right.
So the more often you walk it, and don't do it the next day, because most of the ideas that occurred to you today, you'll remember tomorrow. But if you wait a couple of weeks and those initial ideas kind of cool down a bit, and then you go back, you're much more apt to have a new set of original ideas and then match them up with the first set. and usually walk in the same area at least 3 or 4 times. But that's not our business tradition. Our business tradition is we have a contract and we got to finish by Friday, so let's hurry through here and we'll come up with a plan and it'll be done on Friday and we'll fix it next week, and whatever we do is exactly right and we'll never have to treat it again. And the watershed laughs at you because it's more complex than that, and we have to leave time to come up with original ideas for complex problems.
And it's interesting, too, because when you're working with other people and you're walking through an area to be restored together, everybody will have ideas. And I loved how you said you don't classify them into good ideas and bad ideas. You just call them ideas because you don't even know right away whether they're good or bad.
If you call something a good idea, well, that's good. Then we build on that. And that turns off the novel ideas. You don't need those. You've got a good idea. Well, if you just call it an idea and catch the essentials of that idea and don't call it good, don't call it bad, just recognize it for what it is and save it and then match it with the new ones you come up with later, you're much more apt to be creative. And that's not the norm. We go out with 2 or 3 people and we look at an area and we decide on a plan, and somebody says, well, that's a good idea, and boom, the original thinking stops.
Right. Part of the thing that was also really cool about this film is it really showed how much you worked with other people. For example, the Albuquerque Wildlife Federation, they're doing incredible volunteer work to build some of these structures in watersheds here in New Mexico.
Yes, and I've been a member of Albuquerque Wildlife Federation for over 40 years and proud of what we've done. Albuquerque Wildlife Federation was founded back in 1914 by Aldo Leopold, which is quite an honor in and of itself. And the membership now very much honors that. And it's amazing that fixing creeks has become their favorite hobby. So they come back month after month. They put a lot of their own personal expenses into it to enjoy the opportunity to fix another damaged watershed. And they've become very knowledgeable. And some of the areas that they've been treating, they've treated every year for 25 years now or something. So that gives them a chance to treat a couple 100 yards of damaged creek this year and come back next year and look at the results of what they did last year and treat another couple 100 yards and leave and come back. And so over time, more and more restoration has occurred. But you have all these different age classes to look at each time, so it's an excellent way to learn. And you can see the benefits of what you did, and sometimes what you did wrong. But in total, you'll learn a lot.
And meanwhile, they're building community with each other.
Yes, and very deeply felt in the community. They love it.
And that's another important piece, which is that getting people outdoors and getting people to understand this whole world of how nature works and how water flows. If everybody's indoors watching Netflix and being on their screens all day long, we're in trouble. Yeah. And this is like getting them out of the house.
Yes, it's a good way to get out of the house. Yeah.
Your work has been, as Courtney White called it in the film, kind of institutionalized. It has been adopted by agencies and by the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and state agencies. What does that mean for the work?
Well, the policy varies from one state office of NRCS to the next. So some of them have cost share programs where you can get federal funding to match certain amounts of private funding, so that the NRCS supports doing the projects, and they're defined in a manual that they put together, and it's treatments that I developed, and it's quite an honor. But it's not every state office. It varies from one state to the next.
Is this work transferable to other kinds of ecosystems besides the desert? In other words, does it work in New Hampshire or Georgia or California?
My techniques are being used in almost all western states, different intensity. There's people that their businesses are doing stream and wetland restoration, and they use a lot of my techniques. In Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, there's some very active programs in Colorado, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma.
These are all dry states. These are all kind of west of the 100th meridian.
There's a basic concept that you've mentioned, deserts. And actually here in New Mexico, we've got a lot of different wetland climate changes. If we go just north of Las Vegas, New Mexico, the annual rainfall there is 16 inches. If you go up to the crest of the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, it's 40 inches. If you go to Albuquerque, it's 6 or 7 inches. So the runoff resulting from that, the vegetation types, you go from desert vegetation to pinyon juniper to ponderosa pine to spruce and fir. Each of those is a different degree of wetlands. It's a different degree of runoff that happens. It's different in the time of the year that the runoffs occurs. And treatments are happening in all those different sites, different precip intensities.
And it's so fascinating to me that no matter how much water you have going onto a landscape, it's not just about the number of inches you get per year, it's what happens to that water when it enters the landscape, whether it runs off or whether it really gets absorbed.
Right. And that depends on the steepness of slope, that depends on the type of rock formation that it's flowing over. Is it flowing over granite, or is it flowing over shale or sandstone? And all of those determine the nature of the soils and how fast the water penetrates or permeates into that soil. So, there's many, many different factors, but there's also basic rules that are the same that you need to always apply.
One of the things that happens when you start restoring a landscape and it gets greener, or it gets basically the creeks and the streams and the rivers start to get restored and the water runs into the floodplain, is you see a difference in the kind of vegetation that you have there. So seeds that were dormant, that didn't sprout because there were enough water, suddenly start coming up. I mean, you don't even have to reseed it.
Right. And we have lots of places where we've done vegetation surveys from the beginning of the project for up to 15 years later, and the vegetation community changes without doing reseeding. The seeds are there, or they get washed in or blown in. So, but it's always a thrill when you do a restoration to go out, and what was upland grass today turns out to be sedges tomorrow. And you can see the sedges first start to grow, sedges being water dependent, and the grasses may be totally upland dependent.
You showed the 5-part documentary Thinking Like Water at the Violet Crown Theater here in Santa Fe over a 5-week period, 1 episode each week. And a lot of people came, and they came over and over. What was that like, showing it live and getting the live response for both of you?
Yeah, you're in the editing chair a long time and you come out to show the film and you're not sure if anyone's really going to resonate with it or not. And I really wanted to have a theatrical release, and it was just amazing. I mean, we had a sold out show and we would add another show the first couple episodes. And then we were sold out almost all the shows that the second shows we added as we got into episode 3, 4, and 5. And it was great to show the film, but the amazing part was the Q&A afterwards as well, because you just had ideas and, people might have something happening in their landscapes or ideas of how to get things further out. And so there's just this catalyst that starts happening of people taking what they're learning in the theater seat and wanting to take it out and wanting to know more and actually really getting it, so that even the questions as we went further along in the series, and we did have new people joining in each week too, but the questions even began to have more depth too. So I just think there's a lot of opportunity for it to be really a catalyst. And I'll let Bill talk for himself, but I'm sure he wondered if we were ever actually going to finish the series. So I think for both of us, it was a celebration. And I don't know, in some ways it seemed like it was a reunion because a lot of people also came out to see Bill and see the work on the big screen.
Well, I was very pleased and honored to see the whole series. And a lot of the people who came to watch one or more, most of them came to watch all 5 in the series, not all, had been people that I had worked with for, a few years or many years or 20 years. So they were kind of part of the story, and they liked seeing the results and participating in the results.
What do you do when you are confronted with people who don't understand your work? I mean, it seems like you bring such an attitude of humility and gentleness into the way that you treat other people, but you must get different kinds of reactions to people when you present what you're going to do.
I have received a lot of different kinds of reactions. The basic assumption you have to make is that the statement or the attitude that the speaker has, they're serious about. They're being honest. They're not trying to manipulate you. They have a difference of opinion, sometimes for very good reasons. They've had a range of experience that I haven't had, so that brings a different perspective to looking at what we do. So as long as your audience is sincere, and as long as you can assume that they're sincere, you can make good, honest progress, and new techniques evolve, new feelings evolve. People get involved in doing restoration work that didn't think it was worth the trouble initially. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of different feelings involved in participating and learning to do this and understand the reasons why. So if you think that if you assume that they're honest in the statements they're making and you relate to them in an honest way, you have good communications and make progress.
Have you seen people who were kind of like dead set against these ideas and then they come around when they see the results?
Yes. I've usually worked with the 10 to 20% of people who are committed to want to do this work in the first place because they learned how to do it or learned about it somewhere. And sometimes there's 10 to 20% of the population that's dead set against it because it's counter to what their life experience has been, and then you got 60% or so in the middle that kind of vary from one to the next. But we can see change over time, and we can see often those who are doubtful, they relate to the other person, the other farm or ranch or landowner that gets committed to doing this, and they would rather talk to that person than to me. which is fine because the confrontation possibilities aren't there in dealing with the other landowner who's willing to do these.
Given the reality of climate change and more extreme weather events that are expected in really all ecosystems, but certainly particularly here in the West, what are your hopes for scaling up this work as a way of mitigating the worst effects of climate change?
Well, of course, I hope that it gets scaled up and more people adopt my techniques. And that seems to be true. That's what's occurring. And it varies from place to place. Sometimes there'll be a training session or a video available that excites people, and you get a little burst of energy and enthusiasm in this community or this part of the state. And then you get another person that really is a proponent of the work, and they fire up another effort someplace else. But one of the biggest amusing honors I have had on that regard is in Wyoming. They've been doing my type of treatments, and they have a whole group of, I use one-rock dams and baffles and rolling dips and various kinds of treatments to spread the water or whatever. And they use these treatments from a book, about 10 or 12 of them in the book that they look at every day. And they call them Zeedyks with a little Z. And that's the biggest honor of all I've ever had, is that the structure has become a Zeedyk by name without a capital Z. That's a word in and of itself. That's quite a treat.
Very, very cool. There's so much more that we could talk about. I mean, there's a part of the documentary that is about fixing roads, and dirt roads are a huge problem, but also they can be a big solution when some of these techniques are applied. There's various pieces about beavers and the work that they do, which is very compatible with your work. There's a whole section about urban water catchment and water diversion with the wonderful Brad Lancaster, who's in Arizona. I want to end just by asking you about another phrase that you use, which is a couple of really cool phrases. One is, as you said, when it stops getting worse, it starts getting better. You also say, pull, don't push.
Well, I believe in pull, don't push, because when you pull, you're aiding people to move forward in a positive way. When you push, you might have people pushing back. So I like pull, don't push.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that have implemented my types of treatments, and fixing damaged, low-standard rural roads is huge, because it's a major source of sediment getting into streams and doing damage in the roads so they're not passable when they ought to be. And people like Steve Carson has really developed a career doing restoration of low-standard rural roads, catching the water coming off the road as a resource. And Brad Lancaster's work in Tucson to do restoration and capture water and use it to grow vegetation within the city limits of Tucson has been huge, and he's worked at that for years. So there's many other people that are doing similar work, and some of them use some of my techniques and some of them use other techniques.
Do you feel like you have trained people so this work can go on in future generations?
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe I have.
You've worked with so many different people who've really contributed to this work.
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of people that have put on workshops and planned projects and supervised projects. I worked with Van Clothier for many years. We wrote the book together, Let the Water Do the Work. He was a physicist, so that made terminology easier for him than it was for me. I did a lot of work with Craig Sponholz. He's done videos, and he's restored some very important stream channels, like the creek going through the middle of Las Vegas, New Mexico, which was straightened and damaged 150 years ago when the first railroad was built there. So there's a lot of key people that have advanced the knowledge of and skills how to do this.
And don't forget Quivira Coalition founder Courtney White.
Courtney set the stage for us doing this work through the Quivira Coalition. I remember one time he sat down with me and said, well, that's a good idea. You ought to write a book. 4 years later, we finished the book, but it was Courtney's idea to write it.
Yeah.
Steve Roman has done amazing work, hundreds and hundreds of acres of restoration work on the Piaz Caldera National Preserve. Very meaningful work. There's been work done on several different Native American reservations, Zuni, Pueblo, and others, that there was the feeling and motivation to do that work on those sites. So.
Renee, how can people see the film?
Well, if you go to the thinkinglikewater.com website, there'll be a link there to stream. Right now we're doing a virtual premiere that will go through till January 31st, so you can kick off your own streaming session before then. And then we're really trying to go out into communities and do screenings, as we get into 2025. And then I just kind of really want to get creative with all the different groups that are out there. And really it allows a way for people to study with Bill that haven't been able to, and also to the other proteges and people who are coming and learning and evolving these methods as well. So yeah, if you go to the website, there'll be current information there.
thinkinglikewater.com, Renea Roberts, filmmaker, Bill Zeedyk. What should I call you? What do you call yourself?
Retired.
Land restorer, author of the book Let the Water Do the Work, which is coming out into a third printing from Quivira Coalition this year. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. That's great.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.